Maggie Doyle pushed through the front door of Sundara Table with a tray of fresh cardamom rolls balanced on one arm, the way she had every Tuesday morning for 11 years, and stopped dead in the doorway. A man on a ladder was prying the brass letters off her awning. Sundara, he had already gotten the S and the U down, and they sat in a plastic bin at the base of the ladder like teeth pulled from a mouth. "Excuse me," Maggie said, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. "What exactly do you think you're doing to my sign?" The man glanced down, unbothered. "Just following the work order, ma'am. New branding goes up this afternoon." "Whose work order?" A voice answered from behind her, smooth and pleased with itself. "Mine." Curtis Bennett stood in the doorway of the restaurant she had built with her mother's recipes and her own 2 hands, wearing a blazer that cost more than her first oven, holding a clipboard like he owned the place. He did own it, that was the problem. "You can't just erase 30 years overnight, Curtis," Maggie said, setting the tray down on the host stand because her hands had started to shake, and she refused to let him see that. "I can, actually," he said, tapping the clipboard. "Judge Ferris signed off on the settlement Friday. The LLC, the 4 locations, the commercial kitchen, all of it. It's Bennett Culinary Group now. Has a nicer ring to it, don't you think?" If you've ever watched someone try to erase you from something you built with your own hands, you already know exactly how Maggie felt standing in that doorway. Hit subscribe right now, because what Curtis Bennett is about to find out is going to be worth every second of this story, and I promise you, he never saw it coming. Maggie had married Curtis when she was 29, a broke-line cook with her late mother's recipe box and a dream too big for the one-room kitchen she was renting. Curtis had an MBA and a hunger for something he called scalability, and for the first 10 years that had felt like a gift. He handled the leases, the payroll, the investors. She handled the food. Between them, one restaurant became 4, and Sundara Table became the kind of name that got written up in food magazines with words like beloved and institution. Somewhere around year 20, Curtis had stopped saying, "We built this," and started saying, "I built this." Maggie hadn't noticed the shift happening in real time. It was only looking back, standing in the wreckage of 34 years of marriage, that she could see how slowly and how deliberately he had rewritten the story until she was a supporting character in her own life. "You said the restructuring was for tax purposes," Maggie said quietly. "You said it was to protect the business." "It was protection," Curtis said, "just not the kind you're thinking of." He smiled the smile she used to find charming back when she was 29 and didn't know any better. "You should have read the paperwork more carefully, Mags. That's on you, not me." He turned to the man on the ladder. "Get the other letters down before lunch service. I've got press coming at 3. "Press for what?" Maggie asked. Curtis's smile widened. "The relaunch, Golden Fork Hospitality Group. Vanessa's idea, actually. She thinks Sundara tests poorly with a younger demographic." He said it lightly, like he was mentioning the weather, like the name of her dead mother's kitchen wasn't dissolving in his mouth as easily as sugar. Maggie didn't ask who Vanessa was. She already knew. 29 years old, hired 18 months ago as a brand consultant, always in the office late, always laughing a little too loud at Curtis's jokes. Maggie had suspected for months. She just hadn't had proof until the divorce papers arrived, and she found Vanessa's name listed as co-signatory on the new operating agreement. "You're rebranding my mother's restaurant with the woman you left me for," Maggie said. It wasn't a question. "I'm rebranding my restaurant," Curtis corrected, "with my business partner. There's a difference, and honestly, Elena," he never called her Elena, that was her middle name. He only used it when he wanted to sound like a lawyer instead of a husband. "You should be thanking me. You get the buyout. You get to walk away with a settlement most people would kill for. $200,000 is not nothing. $200,000 for 34 years, for 4 restaurants, for a chain that grossed $11 million last year alone." "And Elena?" Maggie asked. Their daughter, 23, halfway through culinary school on a partial scholarship, the rest funded by tuition payments Curtis had always handled without complaint. "What happens to her tuition?" Curtis's jaw tightened just slightly. "She's an adult. She can take out loans like everybody else. I'm not running a charity here, Maggie. I'm running a business, and businesses don't carry passengers who aren't contributing to the bottom line. Something in Maggie's chest went very still and very cold. She had heard Curtis talk about vendors that way. She had heard him talk about failing locations that way. She had never once imagined he would talk about their daughter that way, standing in the restaurant her own grandmother's hands had helped build, using the word passenger. Like Alina was cargo, he was finally allowed to set down. "You're unbelievable," Maggie said. "I'm honest," Curtis said. "There's a difference." He checked his watch. "The movers are coming for the office equipment at noon. I'd appreciate it if you weren't here when the press arrives. It sends the wrong message. Bitter ex-wife lurking in the background, that sort of thing." He walked past her, out into the California sun, already dialing someone on his phone, already 3 sentences into a conversation about quarterly projections before the door had even swung shut behind him. Maggie stood alone in the restaurant. The letters S and U sat in their plastic bin by the door. Somewhere in the kitchen, she could hear her sous chef, Rosa, quietly stacking pans, pretending not to have heard any of it. If this story is hitting you the way it's hitting me, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, because I want to know who's rooting for Maggie right now. And make sure that like button is smashed before you keep going, because what happens next is exactly why Curtis Bennett should have read his own paperwork. Maggie didn't cry in front of the staff. She had learned, over 3 decades of restaurant ownership, that the kitchen watches everything and forgives nothing, and a crying owner was a kitchen that stopped trusting the ship was seaworthy. She smiled at Rosa, told her lunch service would go on as planned, and walked out the back door into the alley where the dumpsters were, and only then did she let herself shake. She drove home to the small rental condo she'd moved into 3 weeks earlier. Because Curtis had gotten the house too, of course he had, it was in his name on the deed, even though her mother's inheritance had paid the down payment 20 years ago, and she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of her, staring at nothing. Her phone buzzed. It was Alina. "Mom, is it true? Dad's changing the name." "It's true." "He can't just do that. Grandma's name is on the wall. Sundara means beautiful, Mom. You told me that story 100 times. That's not just marketing, that's..." "I know what it is, sweetheart." There was a pause, then Alina's voice, smaller now. "He told me I need to figure out my own tuition. He said it like I was asking him for a favor, like 8 years of him paying for it was a mistake he's correcting now." Maggie closed her eyes. "I heard." "What are we going to do?" Maggie almost said, "I don't know." It would have been the honest answer in that moment, sitting in a rental condo with $200,000 and a daughter whose education had just become a question mark. But something stopped her, a memory, sudden and sharp, of her father sitting across from her at this same kind of kitchen table 30 years earlier, sliding a folder across to her the week before she signed the papers to formalize Sundara Table as a business. "There's something I need to look at first," Maggie said. "Give me until tomorrow." Her father had been a contracts attorney for 40 years before he retired, a careful, quiet man who had watched 2 of his own siblings lose family businesses in divorces and vowed it would never happen to his daughter. When Maggie had turned her mother's single restaurant into a real company, her father had insisted, over her mild protests, that it felt unnecessary, overly cautious, on a very specific piece of paperwork. "The recipes are hers," her father had said, tapping the folder. "Not the company's, not Curtis's, hers, yours, the name, the recipes, the family trademark, none of it belongs to whatever entity you build around it. The entity licenses the right to use them. You license it to yourself, personally, every single year for $1. It's not about money, Margaret. It's about making sure nobody can ever take your mother's kitchen away from you just because they own the building it's sitting in." Maggie had signed it, mostly to humor him, mostly because she'd been 28 and in love and certain nothing would ever go wrong. She hadn't thought about that folder in over 20 years. She wasn't even sure she still had it. She found it at 11 that night, in a fireproof box at the bottom of a closet, wedged between her mother's handwritten recipe cards and a photograph of the very first Sundara Table. back when it was one rented storefront with 4 tables and a hand-painted sign. The document was exactly as her father had described it. The Callahan Doyle Culinary Trust, established in her maiden name, held permanent and exclusive ownership of the trademark Sundara table, all associated logos, and critically, the full recipe library, including the 11 signature dishes that appeared on every single menu across all 4 locations and accounted, according to the restaurant's own internal reporting Maggie had access to for years, for roughly 60% of total revenue. The operating company, the one Curtis now controlled entirely, held only an annual licensing agreement, renewable each year, requiring the written signature of the trust's sole trustee. Maggie Doyle. She read the renewal clause 4 times to make sure she wasn't imagining it. The current license had been signed 11 months ago. It expired at midnight on the last day of the month, 19 days from now. Maggie sat back in her chair, her tea long since gone cold, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she smiled. Stay with me here, because this is exactly the kind of twist. This channel exists for comment the word Sundara below if you're rooting for Maggie now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because Curtis Bennett is about to plan the biggest night of his career on a foundation that isn't his. Maggie called her father's old law partner the next morning, a sharp, unhurried woman named Priya Kaur who had taken over most of his caseload after he retired and remembered Maggie from childhood dinners at the firm's holiday parties. "I need you to confirm this is still valid," Maggie said, sliding the folder across Priya's desk 2 hours later. Priya read it in silence for 10 long minutes. Then she looked up, and there was something almost delighted in her expression. "This is airtight, Margaret. Your father did not mess around. The trademark, the recipes, the trade secrets, none of it was ever a marital asset because none of it was ever owned by the marriage. It was owned by a trust established before the LLC even existed, and the LLC only ever had a revocable license to use it. So if I don't renew..." "If you don't renew," Priya said, "the operating company loses the legal right to use the name Sundara Table, the recipes, the trademark, everything, the instant the license expires. Every menu, every sign, every dish they claim as signature, gone, overnight. And given what your ex-husband signed in the divorce settlement, Margaret, he agreed the operating company owns the physical restaurants and equipment. He never once mentioned the trust. I'd bet everything I have that neither he nor his attorneys ever even looked for it." Maggie thought about Curtis, standing in her restaurant doorway, tapping his clipboard, telling her she should have read the paperwork more carefully. "When does it expire?" she asked, though she already knew. 19 days, Priya said. "What's happening in 19 days? Maggie almost laughed. His relaunch gala, investors, press, the whole thing, Golden Fork Hospitality Group, new name, new logo, everything unveiled live. Priya set down her pen slowly. "Margaret, do you want to let that license lapse on its own, quietly, or do you want to make sure it happens exactly then?" Maggie thought about Elena's voice on the phone, small and frightened, asking what are we going to do. She thought about Vanessa's name on the operating agreement. She thought about the word passenger. "I want him standing on that stage," Maggie said, "in front of every investor he's trying to impress when it happens." For the next 19 days, Maggie said nothing. She showed up to her shifts at the flagship location. Curtis hadn't fired her outright, mostly because firing the chef whose face was still, for now, synonymous with the brand, would have looked strange to the press before the relaunch. And she cooked, and she smiled at customers, and she let Curtis walk past her in the hallway without giving him a single reason to suspect anything. Vanessa, for her part, seemed to enjoy needling her. "You should really think about a consulting role once the transition's finished," she said one afternoon, examining her manicure at the pass while Rosa plated an order behind her. "Curtis says you've got good instincts for the classic stuff. Might be a nice way to stay involved without the stress of ownership." "That's very generous," Maggie said, and meant it, in the way you mean something when you already know exactly how the story ends. 3 days before the gala, Elena called again, this time in tears, not from sadness but rage. He sent me an email, Mom, an actual email like I'm a vendor. It says starting next semester, tuition assistance from Curtis Bennett will be discontinued per restructured financial obligations. He signed it Best, Curtis, Best, like he's closing out a customer service ticket. Maggie closed her eyes and breathed once slowly. Sweetheart, I need you to trust me. Can you come to the relaunch on Saturday as my guest, not his? Mom, why would I want to be anywhere near that? Because, Maggie said, I think you're going to want to see this one in person. The Golden Fork Hospitality Group relaunch was held in the flagship restaurant's dining room, cleared of tables and filled instead with high-top cocktail stations, a string quartet, and roughly 80 people, investors, food critics, 2 local news cameras, and Curtis Bennett standing at the center of it all in a tailored charcoal suit, glowing with the particular confidence of a man who believes he has already won. Maggie stood near the back with Alina beside her and Priya a few feet away, phone in hand, waiting. Curtis tapped his champagne glass with a fork, and the room quieted. 34 years ago, he began, I married a woman with a dream and a recipe box, and together we built something extraordinary. A small, practiced pause. Tonight, we're taking that extraordinary foundation and elevating it into something even bigger. Please join me in welcoming the future Golden Fork Hospitality Group. Behind him, a black curtain dropped, revealing a new logo lit up in gold and white, the words SUNDAIA table nowhere in sight. The room applauded. Vanessa stood beside him, beaming, one hand resting territorially on his forearm. Tonight, Curtis continued, we're also announcing our Series A funding round, opening 4 new locations across 3 states, built on the exact same signature recipes our guests have loved for 20 years. He gestured broadly, expansively. The same soul, the same secret family recipes, just a bolder name to match our bolder future. Maggie checked her watch, 11:58 p.m. At 12:01, Priya's phone buzzed. She looked at Maggie and nodded once. Maggie stepped forward through the crowd, and for the first time all night, Curtis's eyes found hers. Maggie, he said, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before the smile reasserted itself. I'm so glad you could make it. Everyone, this is. I have an announcement of my own, Maggie said, her voice carrying clearly across the quieted room, and I think it's relevant to everything Curtis just said. Curtis's smile faltered just slightly. Maggie now isn't really the... As of 1 minute ago, Maggie said, the licensing agreement between the Doyle Culinary Trust and Bennett Culinary Group, the agreement that granted this company the legal right to use the name Sundara Table and every single recipe on tonight's menu, has expired, unrenewed. Silence dropped over the room like a curtain of its own. What is she talking about? Someone in the crowd murmured. Curtis laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. Maggie, that's absurd. There's no such agreement. The recipes belong to The recipes belong to my mother's estate, held in trust, established by my father in 1994, Maggie said, holding up a folder, the same folder her father had slid across a kitchen table 30 years ago. You own the buildings, Curtis. You own the equipment, the leases, the furniture. You've never owned a single recipe in that kitchen. Not the naan, not the lamb korma, not the cardamom rolls this restaurant became famous for. Every dish on tonight's menu, every dish behind every location you're announcing right now is, as of 2 minutes ago, being served in violation of federal trademark law. That's not, you can't. Curtis's voice had lost its practiced smoothness entirely. I emailed the cease and desist to your general counsel and to every investor on tonight's guest list 4 minutes ago, Priya said calmly, stepping forward beside Maggie. You'll find it in your inbox now. A ripple moved through the crowd, phones coming out, murmured conversations, a food critic near the front already typing notes into her own phone with visible glee. Vanessa's hand slid off Curtis's arm. You're bluffing, Curtis said, though his face had gone pale in a way that suggested he already knew she wasn't. Rosa, Maggie said, without raising her voice, and her sous chef of 11 years stepped forward from where she'd been standing near the kitchen door. along with 3 other chefs from across the 4 locations, all of whom Maggie had personally trained, all of whom had quietly resigned from Bennett Culinary Group that same afternoon and signed on with the new venture Priya had helped Maggie file 2 weeks earlier. "We don't work here anymore, Curtis," Rosa said simply. "None of us do. If you've made it this far, you already know Curtis never stood a chance. Hit that subscribe button right now if you're loving watching him realize it live, and drop a comment telling me the exact moment you knew Maggie had already won." The room dissolved into chaos. Investors pulled their partners aside, whispering urgently. One of the news cameras swung toward Curtis, who stood frozen at the center of his own relaunch, the golden logo glowing behind him over a name he could no longer legally use. Vanessa had already stepped away, phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and clipped, the word liability drifting audibly across the room. "Maggie," Curtis said, crossing to her, his voice dropping into something almost pleading. "You can't do this. We have a deal. The settlement." "The settlement gave you the company," Maggie said. "It never gave you my mother's kitchen. You didn't ask the right questions, Curtis. You just assumed everything I built belonged to whatever you were willing to sign your name to." She closed the folder. "You should have read the paperwork more carefully." He stared at her, and for one long moment, 34 years passed silently between them. The man she had married at 29 and the stranger standing in front of her now, watching his relaunch collapse in real time under lights he'd paid for himself. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now," Maggie said, "I open a new restaurant, same name, same recipes, my name this time on every document." She looked past him to Alina, standing near the back with tears in her eyes that weren't sad tears at all. "And my daughter's tuition is fully covered, starting tomorrow, by a woman who never once needed his permission to take care of her family." 3 months later, Sundara Table reopened 2 blocks away, in a smaller space with the same hand-painted sign style her mother had used 40 years earlier, packed to the door on opening night with customers who had followed the name and the recipes exactly where they belonged. Bennett Culinary Group filed for bankruptcy protection 5 weeks after the gala, unable to secure a single alternate menu that satisfied its investors. Vanessa left the state entirely. Curtis, according to people who still talked to Maggie, was last seen consulting for a chain of frozen yogurt franchises 2 counties over. Elena graduated culinary school the following spring, and now runs the pastry program at her mother's restaurant, and the 2 of them stand behind the same counter most mornings, rolling cardamom dough the way Maggie's mother taught her, in a kitchen that no signature on any settlement had ever truly been able to take away. If Maggie's story moved you even half as much as it moved me telling it, do 3 things before you go. Hit like on this video, drop a comment with the line that hit you hardest, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story of someone who got underestimated and came back stronger than anyone thought possible. I'll see you in the next one.